A Scottish Highlands account described a figure that made no sound. The rain was striking the tin roof of the isolated shelter with the force of handfuls of gravel, making it impossible to hear anything else, which was why the absolute silence of the figure outside felt so deeply wrong. It was exactly 11:45 p.m. when the lone hiker first noticed the dark silhouette moving past the single, cracked window of the stone bothy. The wind sweeping across the barren moorland was strong enough to bend the ancient heather flat against the earth, creating a constant, roaring rush of noise. Yet the tall shape walking just 30 feet away from the glass stood perfectly straight. Its heavy, ragged coat hung motionless around its knees, entirely undisturbed by the gale, as if the entity existed in a completely different physical space, untouched by the violent weather of the world around it. According to the account filed weeks later by an American traveler who had been mapping a remote section of the Scottish Highlands, the strange encounter took place in late October of 2019. He had hiked nearly 14 miles that day, navigating treacherous bogs and steep inclines before seeking refuge in a small, ancient stone structure known only to local shepherds and experienced trekkers. He had secured the heavy wooden door with a rusted iron latch at around 6 in the evening, grateful to escape the rapidly dropping temperature and the creeping gray fog. He had built a small fire in the narrow hearth, drinking bitter tea and reading by the dim light of a single battery-powered lantern. The extreme isolation of the moors was supposed to bring peace, but as he stared out into the darkness that night, he realized he was entirely cut off from the rest of the world, with no cellular service for at least 20 miles in any direction. At first, the traveler desperately tried to rationalize the sight through the window. He reasoned that his exhausted mind was simply playing tricks on him, perhaps projecting the vague shape of a lost stag or a trick of the flickering firelight onto the thick fog rolling outside. But the dark figure did not dissolve into the mist. It took deliberate, impossibly smooth steps through the thick, sucking mud that surrounded the shelter. The hiker slowly leaned closer to the cold glass, using his sleeve to wipe away a layer of condensation. He watched in growing dread as the entity abruptly stopped walking. It turned its upper body slowly, facing the window with a jerky, unnatural motion. The ambient orange light from the indoor fire was barely enough to illuminate the yard, but it was just enough to reveal that the figure was much too tall to be a human being. It stood easily 7 feet high, its limbs unnaturally thin, dangling loosely and motionlessly at its sides. The most unnerving detail, according to the official report he later gave, was the complete lack of physical interaction between the entity and its environment. The Highlands in late autumn are famously hostile and raw. The rain was driving in almost sideways, pooling in deep, treacherous puddles across the peat bog. Yet, as the tall figure shifted its weight and took another step toward the bothy, it made absolutely no splash. The heavy, dark shapes that looked like wrapped feet did not sink into the soft mud. It moved with a gliding, mechanical precision, appearing to float just a fraction of an inch above the saturated ground. The hiker held his breath, pressing his back flat against the rough stone wall beside the window. He realized with a cold certainty that whatever was out there was not fighting the severe storm, but completely ignoring it. 10 minutes passed in agonizing, suffocating suspense. The hiker crouched in the dark, having carefully reached over to switch off his lantern so he could not be easily seen from the outside. The only light remaining in the small room was the dying, pulsing glow of the embers in the hearth. He listened desperately for the sound of heavy boots on the stone step outside, or the metallic rattle of the iron latch on the door. There was only the deafening roar of the wind and the endless drumming of the rain. The sheer volume of the storm should have been comforting, acting as a natural barrier between him and the dark, but instead, it felt blinding. If the silent entity decided to break down the door, the hiker knew he would not hear it coming until the old wood splintered inward. A sudden, aggressive drop in temperature forced the hiker to pull his thick wool jacket tighter around his chest. The air inside the small stone shelter turned bitterly cold in a matter of seconds, dropping so fast that his breath plumed in thick, pale clouds before his face. He slowly turned his head, inch by inch, to look back at the small square of the window. The tall figure was no longer standing out in the muddy yard. It was directly on the other side of the glass. The hiker felt his stomach drop, his heart hammering wildly against his ribs. The entity was so close that its broad, dark shoulders blocked out the storm entirely, filling the entire frame of the window with the texture of its heavy, damp-looking garments. It slowly pressed its face toward the glass. The hiker could not move, paralyzed by a deeply primal terror that locked his muscles in place. The face looking in from the storm was entirely devoid of distinct human features. There were no eyes, no discernible mouth, no brow ridge, just a smooth, pale expanse of skin that looked like worn gray leather stretched tightly over an irregular skull. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the entity raised a long, impossibly thin arm. It pressed a single, elongated hand against the outside of the windowpane. There was no tap of bone, no squeak of wet skin sliding on glass. The absolute dead silence of the gesture made it infinitely more terrifying. As the pale, featureless hand rested against the pane, a thick layer of white frost bloomed rapidly across the window, radiating outward from where the long fingers touched, completely freezing the glass from the outside in until the gray face was entirely obscured by ice. The hiker retreated backward on his hands and knees to the furthest, darkest corner of the room. He gripped a heavy piece of split firewood in his trembling hands, raising it to his chest, and waited for the frozen glass to shatter. He waited for the heavy wooden door to be violently forced open. He sat completely rigid in the freezing darkness for the rest of the night, tracking the agonizing passage of time only by the slow creeping of pale gray light that eventually signaled the arrival of dawn. The furious storm had finally passed, replaced by a dense, quiet morning mist that blanketed the moors. The inside of the bothy was deathly still. At precisely 7:15 a.m., the hiker finally found the courage to stand up. His joints ached terribly from the severe cold and the hours of sustained tension. He approached the door, his throat dry and his hands still shaking. The iron latch was still securely in place exactly as he had left it. The door had not been tested or pushed. The hiker grabbed the handle and shoved it open, wincing at the loud, sharp creak of the rusted hinges, a sound that felt deafening after a long night of straining to hear the impossible. He stepped out into the crisp, biting cold of the Highlands morning. The ground all around the shelter was a thick, muddy paste from the heavy overnight rainfall. He walked carefully around to the side of the stone building, dreading what he might find, to inspect the area directly beneath the single window. According to the statements he would later provide to a skeptical desk officer in a town 40 miles away, there were absolutely no footprints in the mud. There was no sign that a tall, heavy figure had stood there just hours before. There was only one strange disruption in the bleak landscape. Directly beneath the heavily frosted window, the wet grass and muddy peat had been completely replaced by a perfect circle of dry, dead earth, roughly 3 feet in diameter. The soil inside the tight circle was cracked, brittle, and gray, looking as though it had been drained of all moisture and flash-frozen centuries ago. The American traveler went back inside, quickly packed his bag, and left the area entirely, hiking for 9 straight hours without looking back over his shoulder. While local authorities formally dismissed the event as a case of extreme exhaustion and isolation-induced hallucination, older residents in the nearby villages simply nodded when they heard the whispered description. They rarely spoke of the deep moors at night, but when they did, they quietly mentioned that the most dangerous things hunting in the dark are always the ones that never make a sound. One Appalachian holler has been avoided since 1976. It began with the sudden and absolute silence of the tracking hounds. On a freezing November morning in 1976, a search party of 12 men walked into a narrow, deeply shadowed gorge at the base of Blacktop Ridge, looking for a family of 4 who had not been seen in town for 3 consecutive weeks. The dogs had been pulling hard on their heavy leather leashes, eager to trace the familiar scent of wood smoke, old canvas, and livestock. But as the men crossed the tree line into the permanent gloom of the hollow, the hounds simply sat down in the heavy frost. They did not whine, they did not bark at the empty woods. They stared directly into the dense thicket of black walnut trees, their ears pinned flat against their skulls, trembling violently and refusing to take another step forward into the dark. The locals of the county had always kept a respectful, quiet distance from the deep woods of the Appalachian Mountains. There was an unspoken understanding among the older generations that the jagged geography possessed a memory far older than the mining towns built on its edges. But the family living deep in the hollow had been there for over 2 decades. They were quiet, self-sufficient people who traded timber at the local mill and hunted white-tailed deer to survive the bitter mountain winters. According to county tax records from that era, their nearest neighbor lived exactly 4 miles away down a winding, unpaved dirt road. It was this isolated neighbor who finally walked to a payphone at a gas station and called the local dispatcher when the smoke stopped rising from the family's stone chimney and the echoing sounds of their chopping axes ceased entirely. When the search party realized the dogs would not move, they made the decision to leave the paralyzed animals tied securely to a rusted steel guardrail near the main highway. As soon as the men stepped past the tree line without the hounds, the atmosphere within the forest shifted violently. Witnesses later reported in private journals that the temperature within the hollow dropped drastically, plunging far beyond the normal seasonal chill. The heavy frost on the dead autumn leaves appeared unnaturally thick, coating the dark forest floor like jagged shards of broken glass. Every heavy boot step cracked loudly in the freezing cold air, yet the sound did not echo through the trees. The dense, interwoven canopy seemed to absorb the noise instantly, deadening the men's voices as they called out names into the thick, gray morning mist. For the first mile of the hike, the woods were merely quiet, but as they ventured deeper into the gorge, the natural landscape began to change in subtle, deeply unsettling ways. The typical sounds of a mountain morning, the chatter of gray squirrels, the rustling of black crows in the high branches, the wind pushing through the dried pine needles, were completely absent. The stagnant air tasted faintly of copper and old, overturned soil. Some investigators later suspected that the men were already experiencing a form of environmental sickness, a disorientation born from the sheer, suffocating silence of the deep woods. They walked in a tight, single-file formation, their hunting rifles unslung and held tightly against their heavy winter coats, instinctively scanning the empty trees. The geographical features of the hollow soon began to contradict the maps the men had memorized. According to the official county surveys, a rushing creek known as Deadwater Run was supposed to cut directly across the old logging trail, feeding into the larger river several miles away. But when the search party reached the steep ravine where the water should have been flowing, they found only a dry, jagged trench. The riverbed was completely devoid of moisture, the exposed stones bleached white and brittle like old bone. The air above the empty trench shimmered slightly, distorting the shapes of the dead trees on the opposite bank. Several men reported feeling a sudden, intense pressure behind their eyes, a deep phantom ache that only worsened as they crossed the dry rocks and moved deeper into the designated search grid. 2 miles down the abandoned trail, the men found the first undeniable anomaly. Stretched across the dirt path was a line of woven branches meticulously tied together with dried, thorny vines. It was not a standard property fence, but a dense barricade standing waist-high, stretching endlessly into the dark woods on either side of the road. Tangled within the intricate wooden lattice were hundreds of small, rusted iron bells strung up alongside the hollowed-out skulls of small woodland rodents. The metal bells hung perfectly still in the windless air. The men had to carefully dismantle a section to pass through, holding the rusted metal silent with their cold fingers, entirely unsure why a pragmatic, hard-working family would have spent days, perhaps weeks, constructing such a strange and extensive boundary line. Beyond the barricade of bones and bells, the forest looked entirely dead. The towering oak and pine trees had been violently stripped of their bark, leaving pale, bone-white trunks rising like skeletal fingers into the gray sky. According to the accounts passed down through the community, the woods here smelled sharply of ozone and sulfur, a heavy, metallic scent that burned the back of the throat and made their eyes water. The silence had deepened into a physical pressure against their eardrums, a quiet so heavy and absolute it felt like slowly descending into deep water. No one spoke. The urge to turn back was overwhelming, but the county sheriff pressed forward, leading them toward the clearing where the cabin was supposed to be. They reached the family homestead just before noon, though the sky above the hollow was so dark it looked like late evening. The wooden cabin stood at the center of a shallow, bowl-shaped depression surrounded by the towering dead pines. The heavy front door was wide open, swaying slightly on its rusted iron hinges without a breeze. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, and no footprints in the thick frost leading away from the wooden porch. But scattered across the wide dirt clearing were dozens of personal items. Cast iron cooking pots, heavy winter coats, framed family photographs, steel hand tools, and thick wool blankets had been placed carefully on the frozen ground. They were arranged in perfect, mathematical concentric circles, radiating outward from the front steps like ripples in a dark pond. As the sheriff cautiously approached the outer ring of the strange arrangement, he noticed a deeply unsettling detail about the objects. Every single item had been meticulously cleaned. The heavy steel axes were completely free of rust or sticky wood sap. The cast iron skillets held no trace of cooking grease or black soot. Even the worn leather work boots, placed neatly next to a stack of folded winter coats, were completely spotless, devoid of the heavy mountain mud that coated everything in the entire region. It was as if the family had spent their final hours systematically purging every trace of their daily labor from their possessions, preparing them for an exhibition that no one was ever meant to see. Inside the cabin, the stillness was absolute and entirely suffocating. The sheriff stepped slowly over the wooden threshold into a living room, coated entirely in a fine, pale gray dust. It looked exactly like wood ash, but there was no smell of a recent fire, and the large stone fireplace was completely empty. The thick dust lay undisturbed over the wooden dining table, the handmade rocking chairs, the cold cast iron stove, and the unmade beds in the far corner. When the men shone their heavy brass flashlights into the gloom, they realized something impossible. The ash was only present on the furniture and the horizontal floorboards. The vertical walls and the low wooden ceiling were perfectly clean, completely untouched by whatever had settled like a blanket over the room. On the exact center of the dining table, resting precisely in the middle of an ash-covered ceramic dinner plate, was a heavy brass pocket watch. It belonged to the father of the missing family. The sheriff picked it up with a heavy gloved hand, wiping the thick gray dust from the cracked glass face. The intricate metal hands of the watch were moving, but they were spinning backward at a rapid, frantic pace. The faint, mechanical ticking sound was the only noise in the entire room, a fluttering, unnatural rhythm that seemed incredibly loud and abrasive in the dead quiet of the abandoned cabin. As the men gathered tightly in the cramped space, a new sound drifted up from the floorboards. It came from the root cellar located directly beneath the kitchen. It was a slow, rhythmic thumping, followed by a human voice. The men froze instantly, their hands dropping to their holstered sidearms. One of the deputies called out, loudly identifying themselves as the county rescue squad, demanding that whoever was down there come up the stairs slowly with their hands empty. The voice from beneath the floorboards answered, but it did not ask for help. Instead, it repeated the deputy's exact words back to him. The tone was perfectly flat, devoid of any panic or natural human emotion, and it sounded heavily distorted, like a 911 dispatcher speaking through a broken and static-filled radio. The sheriff silently ordered two men to pry open the heavy wooden trapdoor leading down into the subterranean darkness. As they wedged a heavy steel crowbar beneath the iron handle, the mimicking voice abruptly stopped. The rhythmic thumping ceased entirely. The men pulled the door upward on its groaning hinges, fully expecting the suffocating smell of decay or the sudden rush of trapped, stale air to hit their faces. Instead, a wave of freezing cold washed over their heavy leather boots, instantly frosting the denim of their jeans. The bright flashlight beams cut through the pitch blackness below, revealing rows of empty wooden preserves, shelves, and a hard-packed dirt floor. The small cellar was completely empty. There was nowhere to hide, and no secondary exit leading out into the yard. But as the bright beams of light swept slowly across the back wall of the underground room, the men noticed something carved deeply into the cold earth. It was a single word, repeated endlessly, covering every visible inch of the cellar walls, from the floor up to the wooden beams of the ceiling. The letters were jagged and frantic, seemingly gouged into the hard dirt with bare, bleeding hands. The word was simply, wait. Before anyone could speak a word of comfort or confusion, the heavy brass pocket watch resting on the table above them violently shattered. The glass face exploded outward in a shower of sharp fragments, and the frantic ticking abruptly died, plunging the cabin back into absolute silence. The search party did not stay to investigate the surrounding woods. According to the whispered accounts that circulated through the rural community for decades, the 12 men backed out of the cabin without ever turning their backs to the open doorway. They did not touch the bizarre concentric circles of personal belongings arranged in the frozen yard. They did not speak a single word to one another as they marched aggressively back through the pale, barkless trees, their eyes fixed firmly on the dirt trail ahead of them. When they finally reached the barricade of bones and rusted bells, they found that the section they had carefully dismantled had been completely woven back together. The thorny vines were fresh, and the rusted bells were swaying slightly, though there was still no wind in the gorge. Upon returning to the main road at the very edge of the hollow, the men found that the tracking dogs were gone. Their heavy leather collars remained attached to the rusted steel guardrail, but the thick metal buckles had not been unfastened. The thick leather had simply been sliced clean through by something incredibly sharp. The hounds were never found by anyone in the county. The sheriff filed a highly abbreviated, heavily redacted police report the following morning. Before the week was out, he privately requested that the County Road Commission deliver 3 massive dump trucks of heavy gravel and jagged limestone boulders to the entrance of the dirt road leading into the hollow. Within days, the path was completely blocked, barricaded behind a massive wall of stone and a heavy steel chain locked tightly across the surrounding trees. The families of the search party members noted profound and disturbing changes in the men who returned from the hollow. They suffered from severe insomnia, pacing their small homes late into the night, endlessly checking the deadbolts on their doors and windows. When they did sleep, they were plagued by violent night terrors, waking up drenched in cold sweat, but refusing to describe what they had dreamed. One of the younger deputies entirely lost his hearing in his left ear just 3 days after the search. Medical examinations at the local clinic could find no physical cause for the sudden deafness, but the deputy privately confessed to his wife that he had not lost his hearing at all. Instead, he claimed that a continuous, flat voice was constantly whispering a single word directly into his eardrum, drowning out all other sounds in the natural world. The local newspaper published a brief 2-sentence article stating that the family had suddenly relocated out of state due to severe financial difficulties. No further search efforts were ever authorized by the state police. The county slowly and quietly revised its geological survey maps over the following 10 years, intentionally omitting the old logging trail and the narrow, shadowed gorge beneath Blacktop Ridge. The area was simply absorbed into the blank green space of protected wilderness, effectively erased from official existence. The men who walked into the woods that day rarely spoke of it again, and several of them moved entirely out of the Appalachian region before the heavy snow melted the following spring. Today, the deep hollow remains entirely untouched by modern development. Hikers who attempt to navigate the dense, untamed woods often report an unnatural sense of profound disorientation as they approach the eastern slope of the high ridge. Digital navigation devices fail entirely, analog compass needles spin aimlessly in slow circles, and the thick forest canopy seems to trap the dying daylight, plunging the surrounding trees into premature darkness by 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Those who stray too close to the unmarked boundary line often claim to experience sudden nosebleeds and severe migraines, accompanied by the overwhelming primal feeling of being intently observed from the high, dark branches. Some local residents still firmly believe that the ancient barrier of woven vines and rusted bells still exists, hidden deep within the impenetrable overgrowth constantly maintained by an unseen presence. They say that if you find yourself wandering near the rocky base of the ridge and the normal sounds of the forest suddenly drop away, you must immediately turn around and walk directly back the way you came. You must never speak a word, and you must never run, because the quiet in those dark woods is not empty. It is waiting and it is listening. But the most disturbing rumors come from generations of local hunters who track deer along the upper ridges during the absolute dead of winter. When the bitter wind is entirely still and the heavy frost coats the frozen ground, they say you can look down into the shadowed, forgotten gorge and see thin, pale columns of gray smoke rising from a stone chimney that by all official accounts no longer exists. And if you stand very still and listen closely to the suffocating silence, you can sometimes hear a flat, emotionless voice echoing faintly up from the deepest part of the hollow, perfectly mimicking the sound of your own quiet breathing. A Yorkshire moor incident where voices knew their names. The voice did not sound like the wind scraping through the dense, dying heather, though the high moors were famous for playing cruel tricks on isolated travelers. It sounded perfectly human, cutting cleanly through the thick, freezing fog that had settled over the valley, and it was calmly asking for a man named Thomas. It did not use his given name, however. It used a very specific, childish nickname that had not been spoken aloud by anyone in more than 30 years. Thomas and his younger brother, Samuel, stopped walking immediately, the heavy crunch of their hiking boots fading into the sudden, suffocating quiet of the moorland. They were at least 12 miles from the nearest paved road, deep within a notoriously desolate stretch of the Yorkshire landscape. It was late October, 1998, and the temperature had been dropping steadily since noon. The two men were experienced hikers who had planned a 3-day trek across the elevated peat bogs, carrying heavy packs and relying on a compass to navigate the featureless terrain. The moors possessed a bleak, ancient quality characterized by rolling hills of dark peat, hidden sinkholes, and miles of unbroken, rusted heather. The fog had rolled in around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, dropping a curtain of white over the landscape and reducing their visibility to less than 40 feet. They had been navigating in total, focused silence when the voice first called out. Samuel turned slowly toward his brother, his breath forming pale, ragged clouds in the damp air. Neither man spoke at first. They simply stood on the narrow, rocky sheep path, straining their ears against the vast emptiness around them. According to the police report filed days later, the brothers initially tried to rationalize the terrifying sound. They thought it might have been another hiker lost in these severe whiteout conditions, someone who had coincidentally called out a similar sounding word distorted by the dense moisture in the air. They waited for a cry for help, or the sound of footsteps on the gravel. Instead, the voice spoke again, drifting smoothly through the gray mist from their left. This time, the words were absolutely unmistakable. The unseen woman asked why Thomas had broken the small porcelain bird on the windowsill of their old house, detailing a very specific, quiet incident from their childhood in 1974 that only the two brothers knew about. The tone was completely conversational, devoid of panic, effort, or cold. It sounded exactly as though the speaker were sitting comfortably in a warm living room just beyond the opaque wall of fog. Samuel felt a cold, leaden dread settle deep in his chest. He noted later to investigators that the voice possessed the exact cadence, the precise pauses, and the soft northern lilt of their mother, who had passed away 7 years prior. Panic began to take root in their minds, but basic survival instincts kept them anchored to the present reality. Thomas gestured sharply for Samuel to keep moving forward, completely abandoning the sudden, irrational urge to call back to the mist. They adjusted the straps of their heavy packs and picked up their pace, their boots slipping against the damp earth and the slick, exposed roots of the vegetation. The mist seemed to thicken with every 100 yards they covered, wrapping around them like a wet, heavy blanket that muffled all ambient noise. The profound silence of the moors returned, broken only by the frantic, uneven rhythm of their own breathing and the dull thud of their footsteps against the peat. For nearly an hour, they hiked in a grueling, terrified silence, checking the magnetic compass repeatedly to ensure they were still heading south toward their designated waypoint. The landscape offered no landmarks, only endless waves of gray and brown fading into the fog. The ambient light began to fail rapidly as the late afternoon gave way to early evening. Around 5:30 p.m., the pale gray fog darkened into an inky, bruising purple. It was then that they stumbled upon something lying directly in the center of their narrow, muddy path. It was a single, heavy leather hiking glove. Thomas crouched down and picked it up with trembling hands. The leather was completely dry, entirely untouched by the pervasive moorland dampness that had soaked everything else in the environment. More disturbing, however, was the stark realization that it was Thomas's own spare glove. It was a distinctive brand bearing a small, frayed scuff mark on the thumb that he instantly recognized. He had securely packed that exact glove at the very bottom of his rucksack early that morning beneath his sleeping bag and extra clothing. He immediately unbuckled his pack and tore through his meticulously organized belongings. The contents of his bag were undisturbed, but the spare left glove was entirely missing from its sealed, waterproof pouch. Neither man had taken off their packs since noon. The sheer impossibility of the object lying on the trail ahead of them paralyzed them both. As they stood, staring at the leather glove in the fading light, the absolute stillness of the twilight was shattered once again. The voices returned, but there were significantly more of them now. It was no longer just the comforting, familiar sound of their deceased mother. From the deep, featureless shadows to their right came the voice of Samuel's former employer, a man who had moved away a decade earlier, casually discussing the details of a mundane financial spreadsheet. From directly behind them, they heard the distinct, sharp, unmistakable laugh of Thomas's wife. The sounds did not echo across the open landscape. They were flat, incredibly intimate, and projected from various unseen points in the darkness, circling the two men at a radius of what sounded like 50 feet. The brothers abandoned their carefully planned route and began to scramble blindly up a steep, rocky incline, desperately hoping to find higher ground and perhaps escape the dense layer of fog that seemed to be trapping the sounds. The temperature plummeted to near freezing, the cold biting at their exposed faces and hands. The voices did not pursue them aggressively, nor did they raise their volume to shout. They simply kept pace, effortlessly maintaining that invisible 50-foot perimeter no matter how fast the men climbed. As the men exhausted themselves on the steep incline, the casual conversations filtering through the dark began to shift in a deeply sinister way. The unseen entities in the fog stopped reciting old memories and distant conversations. Instead, they began calmly narrating the men's exact present actions. A voice that sounded exactly like Thomas called out from the dark, stating flatly that Samuel was slipping on the wet grass. A fraction of a second later, Samuel lost his footing on a slick patch of moss and fell hard to his knees, scraping his hands raw on the abrasive rock. A voice mimicking Samuel then whispered from the left side of the trail, noting in a clinical tone that Thomas was looking at his compass, but the needle was no longer moving. Thomas stared down at his trembling hand in absolute horror. The red magnetic needle of his compass was frozen perfectly in place, pointing uselessly toward the plastic side casing, completely unresponsive to his frantic twisting and turning. The natural laws of their environment were slowly unraveling, replaced by the impossible logic of the voices in the dark. They had no navigation, no visibility, and no way to outrun the sounds that knew their every move. By 8 o'clock at night, the darkness on the moors was absolute. The fog had merged with the black of the sky, creating a sensory void. Exhausted, freezing, and entirely lost, they managed to set up their small two-person emergency pop-up tent on a relatively flat patch of soft peat. They zipped themselves inside with only a single, dim, battery-powered flashlight illuminating the thin orange fabric of their shelter. They huddled together in the center of the cramped space, clutching their heavy waterproof coats around themselves, shaking from the profound physical cold and the unnatural terror of their situation. Outside the thin nylon walls, the moorland remained dead quiet for a long, agonizingly slow hour. The wind completely died down, leaving an oppressive stillness that pressed against their ears. Then, just after 9:15 p.m., the soft, wet sound of bare feet stepping through the thick mud began to slowly circle the tent. The squelching footsteps were deliberate, unhurried, and impossibly heavy, as if the person walking bore an immense crushing weight. The footsteps stopped directly outside the fabric wall, mere inches from where Thomas sat, with his spine pressed rigidly against the fragile material. The brothers held their breath, their lungs burning, squeezing their eyes shut against the dim light. A voice spoke from the other side of the nylon. It was Thomas's own voice, but it sounded entirely hollow, drained of all warmth, emotion, and humanity. It leaned close to the fabric and whispered a secret that Thomas had never told anyone, not even his brother. It was a dark, deeply personal regret from his early 20s involving a severe, unreported hit-and-run accident on Interstate 90. It spoke the horrible words slowly, savoring the syllables, while something smooth, cold, and heavy dragged lightly against the outside of the tent fabric, sliding down the nylon with a sickening hiss. Samuel squeezed his eyes even tighter, pressing his cold hands over his ears with all his strength, but the voice seemed to bypass his hearing entirely, resonating perfectly and clearly deep within his own skull. He tucked his head between his knees, unable to look at his brother's face, paralyzed by a primitive, overwhelming dread. He remained in that curled, defensive posture, praying silently for the morning sun. According to the official timeline constructed by the authorities, Samuel stayed perfectly still, refusing to open his eyes or lower his hands until the pale, gray light of dawn finally began to filter through the orange fabric of the tent. When he finally found the courage to look up, the harsh reality of the morning offered no comfort. He was completely alone in the small space. The zipper of the tent was still fully closed from the inside, the metal teeth perfectly aligned and undisturbed. Yet, Thomas was entirely gone. He had left behind his heavy leather hiking boots, his insulated winter coat, and his fully packed rucksack. There was no tear in the fabric, no sign of a struggle, and no logical way a grown man could have exited the shelter without unzipping the door. A massive search and rescue operation was launched across the moors later that afternoon, initiated only after Samuel managed to hike down to a small, isolated farming village and dial 999 from a public telephone. Over 40 trained volunteers, tracking dogs, and local authorities combed the desolate landscape for 6 exhaustive days. They found absolutely no trace of Thomas. The tracking dogs refused to approach the campsite, whining and pulling against their leashes. There were no footprints leading away from the tent in the soft mud, no discarded clothing on the moors, and no clues to suggest where he might have gone in the freezing night without his boots or coat. The police eventually suspended the search, filing a formal report that dismissed Samuel's account of the voices as severe psychological trauma. They officially concluded that he had suffered from acute auditory hallucinations induced by extreme hypothermia, physical stress, and isolation. The case was quietly closed, categorized as a tragic wilderness disappearance, the kind that happens occasionally when arrogant hikers underestimate the brutal nature of the high bogs. But the locals who lived on the edge of the vast emptiness knew better than to trust the official police narrative. Months after the search was officially suspended, strange, quiet reports began to surface among the isolated farming communities bordering the moors. Shepherds rounding up stray flocks in the dense evening fog would occasionally hear a lone man's voice drifting across the empty expanse of heather. The voice was always incredibly calm, always perfectly conversational, and it always called the solitary shepherds by their full legal names. It would quietly ask them about their private grievances, their hidden debts, or their quietest sins, speaking from the impenetrable mist just beyond their sight. The legend of the conversational voices on the high moors remains a deeply unsettling local secret, a permanent scar on the landscape, and a quiet warning to those who think the empty places of the world are truly silent. An Alaska bush pilot reported something following his aircraft. The unnatural drop in cabin temperature happens first, followed almost immediately by the compass needle drifting lazily away from true north. The pilot, a man named Arthur, is entirely alone above the vast, empty expanse of the Yukon-Koyukuk region. It is 11:40 p.m. on a moonless Tuesday in late November. The glass of the windshield is coated in a creeping layer of frost. But what catches his attention is not the ice, it is the solid black shape moving steadily just off his right wing. It is darker than the night sky, a massive void blocking out the distant, cold stars. Arthur has flown these northern routes for 14 years. He knows the unforgiving airspace like the back of his hand. He is flying a standard, unglamorous cargo run, carrying mail, heavy machinery parts, and medical supplies from a small, isolated outpost back toward the airfield in Fairbanks. The flight is normally a quiet, meditative stretch of time, marked only by the steady, rhythmic drone of the single engine and the faint red glow of the instrument panel illuminating his tired face. Below him, the landscape is a frozen, jagged wasteland, heavily forested and entirely devoid of human life. There are no roads down there, no cabins, no emergency landing strips. There is just an endless ocean of deep snow and ancient pine where the temperature sits at 40 degrees below zero. He reaches forward to adjust the frequency on his aviation radio. He depresses the button on the worn control yoke to hail the regional flight service station, intending to ask if there is any other logged traffic in his sector. When he speaks into the headset, the only response is a thick, wet static. It does not sound like typical atmospheric interference or a lost signal. It sounds heavy and deliberate, almost rhythmic, like the slow, mechanical breathing of something massive resting at the bottom of a deep well. He tries a different frequency, twisting the dial to the universal emergency channel. The bizarre static follows him. It is perfectly uniform across every band. The shape on his right begins to shift. It does not bank or turn the way a conventional aircraft should. It simply slides laterally through the air, maintaining a perfect, unnatural parallel to his wing. Arthur reduces his speed, pulling the throttle back slightly to let the strange object pass him by. The needle on his airspeed indicator drops to 100 knots. The massive shadow slows with him. It matches his deceleration instantly without any visible thrust, exhaust, or momentum correction. The engine of his small plane struggles against the freezing thin air, but from the void outside, there is absolute, terrifying silence. A cold sweat breaks out on the back of his neck, chilling him despite his heavy winter gear. According to aviation reports and local legends, pilots in the far north occasionally see strange things over the ice. They see ice crystals reflecting moonlight, classified military test flights out of distant bases, or the aurora borealis playing tricks on tired eyes. But there is no moonlight tonight, and no military aircraft flies without strobe lights while hugging the side of a civilian plane in the dead of winter. Arthur pushes the yoke forward, descending 500 feet in a sudden, evasive maneuver. His stomach drops with the sudden loss of altitude. He levels out at 5,500 feet. He looks out the frost-covered right window. The black mass is still there, filling the space exactly as it had before, perfectly matching his dive. The temperature inside the tiny cockpit continues to plummet rapidly. The small cabin heater, which had been working perfectly for the first 2 hours of the flight, now blows freezing air that bites at his exposed cheeks. Ice begins to creep rapidly across the inside of the windows, forming complex, jagged patterns that distort his view of the outside world. He reaches out with a thick, gloved hand to wipe the frost away from the side window. As his hand nears the glass, the hairs on his arm stand straight up. A heavy, crackling, static charge fills the small cabin, making the air taste like copper and ozone. The analog dials on his instrument panel begin to twitch violently. The altimeter spins out of control, registering an impossible climb to 10,000 feet, then a sudden dive to zero, over and over again. Up until now, the object has been nothing more than a silhouette, a hole in the sky. But as the dark shape drifts slightly forward, pacing the nose of his plane, Arthur notices a faint, unnatural illumination along its lower edge. It is a dull, sickly yellow glow, the color of old, rotting parchment. The light does not cast beams into the dark sky. It seems to be absorbed by the dark metal or whatever unknown material the craft is made of. The glow pulses slowly, swelling and fading to the exact rhythm of the heavy, wet static still broadcasting in his headset. With each pulse of the yellow light, the engine of his small plane coughs, the revolutions per minute dropping dangerously low before recovering. Panic begins to take root in his chest, cold and sharp. If the engine dies over this remote stretch of mountains in the middle of winter, there is absolutely no chance of survival. There is nowhere to glide, nowhere to land, and even if he somehow manages to bring the plane down into a snowbank without tearing it apart, the sub-zero temperatures will freeze him solid before morning. He frantically taps the fuel gauge with his knuckle, making sure the line is not freezing solid. The tank is half full. He adjusts the fuel mixture, trying desperately to keep the struggling engine running smooth. But the mechanical components of his plane feel entirely secondary now. The object outside is dictating the reality of the airspace. The yellow light pulses again, much brighter this time. The engine sputters hard, a violent metallic shudder vibrating through the entire airframe. The massive object suddenly banks directly toward him. The sheer scale of it becomes terrifyingly clear in the darkness. It is not the size of another small cargo plane. It is the size of a large commercial airliner, perhaps even larger, but it has no wings. It is shaped like a massive, blunt cylinder, perfectly smooth and devoid of windows. It closes the distance between them in a fraction of a second, violating all known laws of inertia and aerodynamics. It is so close now that it blocks out the entire right hemisphere of the sky, its hull looming just feet from his wingtip. The dull yellow light shifts violently. It turns into a blinding, pale green luminescence that completely floods the cockpit. The pale light washes out the comforting red glow of his instruments. It casts long, unnatural, stretching shadows across the cabin. In that blinding green glare, the loud, steady sound of his own engine disappears completely. The silence that follows is absolute and crushing. For several agonizing seconds, Arthur is suspended in a soundless void, falling through the night sky in a dead metal tube bathed in sickly green light. He grabs the controls, pulling back with all his strength. The yoke goes completely stiff. It will not budge a single inch. The rudder pedals are locked firmly in place. He is no longer flying the aircraft. He is a helpless passenger in his own plane, trapped in a silent, invisible grip of unknown origin, plummeting quietly toward the jagged mountain peaks hidden in the dark below. He waits for the inevitable impact. He watches the broken altimeter dial, which is now completely frozen at 4,000 feet. The green light outside the window is so intense he can see the dark blue veins in the back of his own hands, sharp and clear against his pale skin. Then, as abruptly and inexplicably as it began, the green light extinguishes. The heavy, crushing pressure in the cabin vanishes in an instant. The control yoke jerks violently forward in his hands, nearly breaking his wrists. The deafening mechanical roar of the single engine returns, painfully loud after the profound, unnatural silence. The plane drops sharply, catching a turbulent updraft. Arthur fights the controls, desperately pulling the nose up just as the dark, jagged silhouette of a snow-covered mountain ridge scrapes past the underbelly of the aircraft. He clears the deadly peak by less than 200 feet. The plane rattles and shakes in the disturbed air, but the propeller is spinning. It is flying. He gasps for air, his lungs burning deeply as if he has been holding his breath underwater for minutes. He looks frantically out the right window. The sky is entirely empty. The distant stars have returned, cold and indifferent, scattered across the endless black canvas of the northern night. The heavy, breathing static in his headset is gone, replaced entirely by the normal, quiet hiss of an empty radio frequency. He does not reach out to touch the radio again. He flies the remaining 80 miles to the airfield in complete, paranoid silence, keeping his eyes fixed straight ahead through the frosted glass. Every dark cloud on the horizon looks like a massive, silent cylinder waiting to drop out of the sky and swallow him. He lands the plane at the empty airfield just after 1:30 a.m. The yellow runway lights seem unnaturally bright, burning his tired eyes. When he taxis the aircraft to his designated hangar and finally cuts the engine, he does not immediately unbuckle his harness. He sits alone in the freezing dark cockpit, his hands shaking violently on his lap, staring blankly at the frost slowly melting on the glass. When the sleepy ground crew finally approaches with flashlights to ask why he is just sitting there in the dark, Arthur unbuckles his belt and steps out onto the icy tarmac. His legs are weak, barely able to support his weight. He tells the mechanics to check the electrical system, claiming he suffered a temporary alternator failure over the mountains. He does not mention the massive shadow. He does not mention the dead silence or the blinding green light. The official maintenance report, filed by the crew 3 days later, notes absolutely no mechanical faults with the engine, the battery, or the alternator. The plane is thoroughly inspected and deemed perfectly safe for regular flight. However, the lead mechanic mentions a highly unusual anomaly in his handwritten notes at the bottom of the page. Along the entire right side of the aluminum fuselage, the standard white paint is heavily discolored. It is a pale, sickly yellow, as if the metal had been subjected to intense, localized heat or strange radiation. The scorch mark is massive, extending unbroken from the nose of the plane all the way to the tail, yet the metal itself is not warped or melted in any way. Arthur never flies that northern route again. He quietly requests a transfer to daytime cargo runs in the southern, more populated part of the state, avoiding the remote mountain passes entirely. Other veteran pilots occasionally ask him about the strange, yellow discoloration on the side of his old plane, which remains parked at the far edge of the frozen airfield. They ask if he flew through a strange chemical cloud or if weird atmospheric lightning struck the wing during a storm. He always gives a vague, dismissive answer and quickly changes the subject. But on cold, moonless winter nights, when the aviation radio in the dispatch office picks up a heavy, rhythmic static, the older pilots at the airfield fall perfectly silent. They step outside and look out toward the dark northern horizon, wondering what is drifting quietly through the freezing blackness, pacing the empty skies, waiting for the sound of a lonely engine. A Banff trail case where time did not match the distance. When search and rescue volunteers finally located David near the lower bend of the Banff Ridge Trail, the immediate confusion was not that he was injured, but that he was entirely unrecognizable. He had been missing for exactly 48 hours. Yet, as the lead tracker approached the slumped figure resting against a decaying cedar tree, he noted that the man possessed a thick, untrimmed beard and fingernails that had grown long, yellowed, and brittle. His hiking boots, purchased brand new just 3 days prior, according to his wife, were worn down to the smooth, treadless rubber. The leather of the boots was cracked and bleached by an impossible amount of sun. He sat only 2 miles from the main parking lot, staring vacantly into the dense, damp ferns. The incident occurred in October of 1998 in a remote, fog-heavy stretch of the Cascade Mountains. David was 34 years old, an experienced outdoorsman who closely followed local elevation shifts and weather patterns. He had planned a simple 6-mile loop up the ridge and back down through the valley. It was a Saturday. He left a detailed itinerary on his kitchen counter, stating he would be home by 6 o'clock in the evening. When darkness fell and his vehicle remained the only one left in the gravel lot at the trailhead, the local Forest Service was notified. By Sunday morning, a standard grid search had commenced. The weather was unusually mild for late autumn. There was no rain, no sudden drop in temperature, and no wind to disturb the forest floor. Search dogs were brought in to trace his scent from the driver's side door of his car to the wooden trailhead marker. They followed the invisible path easily for the first mile, their noses pressed to the damp earth. But near an area locals called the Silent Basin, a natural depression surrounded by towering, moss-draped Douglas firs, the dogs stopped. They did not bark, and they did not whine. They simply sat down on the trail, refusing to cross an invisible threshold, their focus locked on the empty woods ahead. The human searchers pressed on, leaving the animals behind and moving through the basin in a sweeping line. The silence in that specific section of the forest was profound. Several volunteers later reported a strange heavy pressure in their ears, similar to the sensation of descending rapidly in an airplane. The natural sounds of the woods, the rustling of leaves, the calls of distant birds, and the rushing of nearby creeks simply ceased to exist. It was in this pocket of dead air that they found the first strange piece of evidence. It was a single boot print pressed deep into a patch of soft mud. The tread pattern matched the new boots David had been wearing. However, the stride length was entirely wrong. The distance between the right footprint and the next left footprint was nearly 9 feet. It was a distance impossible for a man to cover in a single walking step, suggesting he had been running at a dead sprint or perhaps leaping in blind terror. More disturbing to the trackers was the direction. The footprints did not lead deeper into the woods, nor did they lead back toward the trail. They turned abruptly and led straight into a dense wall of thorny underbrush where no path existed. Following the projected path of those leaping strides, a volunteer found a discarded plastic water bottle resting upright on a flat stone. It belonged to David. It was completely empty, bone dry on the inside, without a single drop of condensation. The clear plastic had yellowed significantly and turned brittle to the touch, exactly as if it had been sitting in the relentless heat of a desert sun for several years. When the volunteer picked it up, the plastic cracked audibly beneath the light pressure of his fingers. The search was suspended at nightfall and resumed early Monday morning. The atmosphere on the mountain had shifted overnight. A thick, clinging mist rolled through the pine trees, limiting visibility to less than 50 feet. At approximately 9:15 a.m., a Forest Service dispatcher monitoring the emergency radio channels caught a brief, heavily distorted transmission. It was not broadcast on the standard civilian band, nor was it intercepted on a ham radio frequency. It came through on a secured tactical channel used exclusively by park rangers and emergency personnel. The voice breaking through the heavy static was weak, parched, and trembling. It was later positively identified as David by his wife, though the tone was undeniably altered. He did not ask for help. He did not provide his coordinates or describe his injuries. Instead, the dispatcher listened as the man muttered in a low, exhausted, almost hypnotic monotone. He stated clearly that the sun had not come up. He repeated this exact phrase 3 times. He then whispered that he had been walking down the same slope for weeks, but the trees were only getting taller and the path beneath his feet was turning to gray ash. The transmission ended abruptly with a sharp, mechanical click. Tracking the signal proved impossible. The radio tower logs showed no origin point for the broadcast, no triangulation data, and no registered radio ID. It was as if the audio had simply manifested directly out of the speakers in the dispatch room. Meanwhile, the ground teams were circling back toward the lower bend of the trail, sweeping an area they had already thoroughly checked the day before. The mist was particularly thick near the base of the ridge. It was here, just 20 yards off the marked path, that a volunteer noticed a dark shape huddled against the massive roots of a dead tree. David did not react when his name was called. His eyes were open, but he did not blink. The pupils were dilated to the very edge of his irises, rendering his eyes completely black against the pale whites. The paramedics who arrived on the scene documented an array of physical impossibilities. He was severely malnourished, his collarbones and rib cage visible beneath the torn remnants of his wool sweater. His skin was leathered, deeply tanned, and heavily weathered. The internal zipper of his jacket, made of stainless steel, had rusted completely shut. But the most disturbing detail was the digital watch strapped securely to his left wrist. The glass face of the watch was scratched and clouded with thick condensation. The digital readout was still functioning, powered by a specialized, long-lasting battery. When the lead medic checked the screen to log the official time of recovery, he found that the watch displayed a date in the middle of October in the year 2005. The internal calendar of the device had advanced exactly 7 years over the course of 48 hours. The stopwatch function, which David frequently used to time his hikes, was still running. It showed over 61,000 hours logged. They carried him out of the woods on a rigid backboard. He offered no resistance, his limbs limp and unresponsive. The medics estimated he weighed no more than 110 pounds, a staggering loss from his documented weight of 180. At the local hospital, the attending physicians were baffled by his preliminary blood work. His body showed the advanced stages of prolonged starvation and severe vitamin deficiencies, conditions that typically take many months, if not years, to develop. The soles of his feet provided further grim evidence. When the nurses removed the remnants of his wool socks, they found the skin covered in thick, hardened calluses. The heels were split and bleeding, with layers of dead tissue built up in a manner consistent with someone who had walked barefoot across rough terrain for thousands of miles. Yet, despite these signs of immense physical decay over an agonizingly long period, an examination of his digestive tract revealed the partially digested remains of the oat granola bar he had been seen eating in his car on Saturday morning. Biological time and chronological time had violently separated within his own body. Investigators attempted to piece together the missing 2 days by examining his personal belongings. His day pack, constructed of heavy-duty, weather-resistant nylon, was frayed at every seam. The bright red fabric was bleached almost white, heavily stained with a pale gray dust that did not match the soil composition of the Cascade Mountains. Deep inside the main compartment, wrapped inside a brittle plastic bag, they found his 35mm camera. The film roll was carefully extracted in a darkroom and sent to a specialized laboratory for development. There were 24 exposures on the roll. The first 3 photographs were perfectly normal. They depicted the gravel parking lot, the wooden trailhead marker, and a shot of the morning mist rolling through the lower valley. The lighting was consistent with an overcast Saturday morning. The 4th photograph, however, showed the edge of the silent basin, and the lighting was deeply unnatural. The shadows cast by the dense fir trees fell in conflicting directions, crisscrossing over the trail, suggesting multiple dim light sources in the sky, none of them directly overhead. From the 5th frame onward, the images documented a landscape that no park ranger, surveyor, or local historian could identify. The trees in the photographs were dead and entirely stripped of bark. Their trunks were smooth, twisting upward like blackened, broken fingers against a pale, featureless sky. The ground was covered in a thick layer of the same gray ash found on his backpack. There was no underbrush, no rocks, and no trail markers. Just an endless, repeating expanse of dead timber and gray dust. The photographs grew increasingly erratic as the roll progressed. Frames 15 through 20 were heavily blurred, taken in motion. The camera was pointed downward or angled wildly at the sky, suggesting the photographer was running in absolute panic. The lighting in these middle frames grew progressively darker, the featureless sky fading into a deep, impenetrable black. The final photograph on the roll, the 24th frame, remains the most debated and heavily classified piece of evidence in the entire case file. It was severely underexposed, dominated by absolute darkness. But near the center of the frame, caught in a grainy, out-of-focus blur, was a towering structure. It appeared to be a massive stone staircase carved directly into the side of an impossibly sheer cliff face. Standing on the lower steps of this staircase were tall, vaguely human silhouettes. They were elongated and impossibly thin, their limbs disproportionate to their bodies. Their featureless heads were turned entirely toward the camera lens. The only illumination in the photograph was a dim, sickly red glow radiating from the top of the stairs, casting long, unnatural shadows down the steps. David never regained the ability to speak. He spent his remaining weeks in a secure, private room in a state medical ward. He spent his days sitting rigidly in a chair, staring blankly out the window at the distant tree line of the surrounding hills. He refused to sleep in the dark. He became violently agitated, screaming soundlessly if the nurses attempted to turn off the overhead fluorescent lights. Whenever the room darkened, even momentarily from a passing cloud, he would scramble backward, press his spine against the farthest wall, and cover his eyes with his bruised, trembling hands. His physical deterioration accelerated at a terrifying, unnatural rate. Within a single month, his untrimmed hair and beard turned entirely stark white. His teeth loosened and fell out. His bone density collapsed, leaving him fragile and bedridden. Medical specialists were flown in from out of state, but they could only diagnose his condition as an incredibly aggressive, entirely unprecedented form of rapid cellular aging. He was aging years in a matter of days. He passed away quietly in his sleep on a Tuesday evening in late November, exactly 6 weeks after he was found near the trail. The official death certificate filed by the county coroner listed the primary cause of death as complete heart failure brought on by severe environmental exposure and clinical dehydration. No mention of the advanced cellular decay, the mismatched timeline, or the impossible state of his equipment was included in the public medical record. The investigative case file was quietly closed. The anomalies were officially written off in internal memos as severe delirium combined with manufacturing defects in his gear. His digital watch was placed in a sealed evidence locker in the basement of the regional precinct, its scratched screen still glowing, silently counting the thousands of impossible hours. The camera, the brittle water bottle, and the envelope of developed photographs were archived deep within the state's missing persons database, filed under an obscure case number, rarely requested and never published for the public to see. But among the tight-knit community of search and rescue teams who still work the Banff Ridge Trail, the story of David remains a quiet, persistent warning. The veteran trackers of the unit will never hike through the Silent Basin alone, regardless of the weather. They advise newcomers to always keep a close eye on their own shadows, ensuring they only ever point in one single direction. And if the surrounding forest ever grows completely, entirely silent, if the birds stop calling and the wind dies down to nothing, they are told to turn around immediately and walk back to the parking lot. They are warned to leave before the path beneath their feet begins to stretch, before the trees start to grow unnaturally tall, and before the time required to walk home becomes longer than the years they have left to live. A Dartmoor report described a voice that matched his wife. Exactly. It was 2:15 in the morning when the man stood completely still in his dark kitchen, listening to his wife call for help from the edge of the woods. Her voice was trembling, cutting through the dense fog that rolled off the tree line, begging him to open the back door. The sound was distinct and terrified, carrying the exact pitch and slight rasp she always had when she was frightened. But he did not reach for the deadbolt. He kept his hand pressed flat against the cold wood of the doorframe, his breathing shallow, because he could hear the steady, rhythmic breathing of his actual wife drifting down the stairs from their second-floor bedroom. The property sat at the end of a long, unpaved gravel road in Dartmoor County, a deeply rural stretch of the Pacific Northwest known for its oppressive weather and vast, unbroken tracts of pine forest. According to local records, the area had always struggled with a spotty telephone network and a peculiar acoustic phenomenon. Sound traveled strangely across the damp valleys. A falling tree could sound like a gunshot, and the wind moving through the ravines often mimicked the drone of a low-flying airplane. But the voice filtering through the glass of the kitchen door was not a trick of the wind. It was a precise, flawless replication of a human voice layered with artificial emotion. The man, whose name was detailed in later police reports only as Thomas, remained in the dark. Outside, the pleading continued. The voice repeated the same three phrases in a loop. It asked him to come outside, it said it was cold, it said it had lost the flashlight. Thomas realized with a sinking sickness that these were the exact phrases his wife had used 3 years earlier during a camping trip in another state when she had briefly lost her way near their tent. The cadence was perfectly preserved, like an audio recording pressed into the damp night air. A heavy silence fell over the yard. The voice stopped mid-sentence, cutting off abruptly without any natural fade or intake of breath. Thomas pressed his cheek against the frosted glass of the back window, peering out into the impenetrable blackness. There was no movement near the tree line. The motion sensor light attached to the garage, which was sensitive enough to trigger when a stray deer wandered past, remained completely dark. Yet, he could hear the unmistakable sound of wet leaves compressing under heavy, deliberate footsteps. They were moving closer to the house, but the rhythm was entirely wrong. It sounded like something walking on two legs, but the steps were spaced too far apart, dragging slightly with every second stride. According to the incident report filed days later, Thomas finally backed away from the door and retrieved a heavy steel flashlight from the kitchen counter. He did not turn it on. He moved silently through the first floor, checking the locks on the heavy oak front door and the sliding glass panels in the living room. Every window was secured. As he stood in the center of the living room, surrounded by the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the adjacent room, a new sound began. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping against the glass of the living room window. Thomas froze. The window was located on the side of the house where the ground dropped away into a steep ravine. To reach that glass from the outside, a person would need to be standing on a tall ladder, or they would have to be nearly 9 feet tall. The tapping continued, patient and unhurried. Then the voice returned, but it was no longer screaming, it was whispering right against the external pane of glass. It whispered Thomas's name over and over, mirroring the gentle, sleepy tone his wife used when waking him up in the morning. The history of Dartmoor County is scattered with strange, fragmented reports of auditory anomalies. Archival newspaper clippings from the 1970s describe loggers walking off their job sites, claiming they heard their foreman calling them into deep, unmarked sections of the forest. In 1992, a search and rescue team spent 3 days looking for a missing hiker because they kept hearing his voice echoing from the bottom of a limestone gorge. When they finally found the man, he had been deceased for over 48 hours, making it medically impossible for him to have been shouting for help that morning. These incidents were often rationalized as echo delays or the stress-induced auditory hallucinations of exhausted searchers. But standing in his living room, Thomas knew he was not hallucinating. The whisper against the glass was too tactile, too physically present. The condensation on the outside of the window seemed to blur, disturbed by hot breath. Slowly, Thomas raised the heavy flashlight and clicked the beam on, aiming it directly at the window. The bright circle of light illuminated the swirling fog and the bare branches of an oak tree. There was nothing standing outside the glass. The air was empty. But the whispering did not stop. It simply shifted, the source of the sound moving rapidly along the exterior wall, traveling faster than a human could run. The voice slid along the vinyl siding, moving toward the front porch. Thomas tracked the sound from the inside, his heart pounding a heavy rhythm against his ribs. He heard the wooden planks of the porch groan under a sudden, immense weight. Then came the sound of the front door handle jiggling. It was a violent, frantic rattling, as if someone was desperately trying to force the lock. Thomas raised the flashlight like a weapon, bracing himself. Over the noise of the rattling handle, a new voice spoke. It was deep, panicked, and distinctly male. It was his own voice. The voice outside the door was screaming to let him in. It was a flawless imitation of Thomas shouting for his wife, demanding she unlock the door and call 911. Thomas listened to himself panic. He listened to the exact timbre of his own terror, a terror he was currently feeling but had not yet voiced aloud. The mimicry was so uncanny that for a fleeting, disorienting second, Thomas felt a severe detachment from his own body. He wondered wildly if he was the one trapped outside in the freezing fog, and the thing standing inside the dark hallway was the imposter. Up on the second floor, a floorboard creaked. Thomas snapped out of his paralyzing trance. The noise outside the front door vanished instantly, plunging the house back into suffocating silence. He heard his wife's footsteps moving slowly down the carpeted stairs. She called out his name, her voice thick with sleep and confusion. Thomas immediately warned her to stay back, to stay on the stairs. He kept his flashlight trained on the front door, the solid wood suddenly looking very fragile. She asked him what was going on, why he was standing in the dark. He did not know how to explain that he had just spent 20 minutes listening to both of them beg for their lives from the other side of the walls. They sat together on the floor of the upstairs hallway until dawn, the bedroom door locked, waiting for the sun to burn off the fog. The local police arrived shortly after 8 o'clock in the morning. 2 deputies walked the perimeter of the house while Thomas and his wife watched from the kitchen window. The officers found no signs of forced entry. The locks were intact, the glass was undisturbed, and the motion sensor lights were confirmed to be in perfect working order. However, the official police report noted one peculiar detail that the deputies could not easily dismiss. In the damp soil beneath the living room window, the window that overlooked the steep drop-off into the ravine, there were deep impressions in the mud. They were not footprints, they were long, smooth drag marks, as if something incredibly heavy and completely lacking limbs had pulled itself back and forth beneath the glass. The marks stretched all the way around the foundation of the house, leading up the steps to the front porch, and eventually disappearing into the thick brush at the edge of the tree line. Desperate for proof that they were not losing their grip on reality, Thomas purchased a digital audio recorder from an electronics store 50 miles away. He placed it on the wooden railing of the front porch, wrapped in a plastic bag to protect it from the creeping dampness of the fog. He set it to activate only when it detected a sound louder than a whisper. For 3 nights, the device captured nothing but the low hum of the wind and the occasional patter of freezing rain against the wooden deck. On the 4th morning, the digital display indicated that 42 minutes of audio had been recorded between the hours of 3 a.m. and 4 o'clock in the morning. Thomas and his wife sat at the kitchen table, sunlight streaming through the windows, and pressed play. At first, there was only static, then the distinct crunch of gravel. Something heavy was dragging itself up the driveway. The sound was wet, accompanied by a low, rhythmic wheezing that did not sound remotely biological. Then the voices began. It was not just Thomas and his wife. The recorder had captured a chaotic, layered chorus of conversations. They heard a mail carrier they had spoken to weeks ago asking about a stray dog. They heard a neighbor complaining about a fallen tree. They heard the 911 dispatcher from the night of the first incident repeating her calm, practiced instructions on a loop. The entity outside was practicing. It was sifting through an archive of stolen sounds, testing syllables, adjusting its pitch, searching for the frequency that would compel someone to unlock the door. The most disturbing part of the recording came at the very end. The layered voices abruptly cut out, leaving a hollow, dead silence. Then, a voice spoke directly into the microphone. It was impossibly close, the breathing heavily distorted by the plastic bag. It was the voice of Thomas's wife, humming a tuneless, repetitive melody. It was a melody she only ever hummed while she was completely alone, folding laundry in the basement. The entity had been listening to them long before it ever made itself known. The illusion of safety shattered permanently on a Tuesday evening in late November. The sun had set early, casting long, bruised shadows across the yard. Thomas's wife was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, while Thomas was in the basement organizing a set of tools. The basement was unfinished, a cavernous space of exposed concrete and damp earth, lit by a single bulb swinging from a wire. As he sorted through a box of nails, he heard her call down the wooden stairs. She asked him to come up and look at something outside the window. Her voice was calm, casual, lacking any trace of alarm. Thomas dropped a handful of nails back into the box and began walking toward the staircase. He had his foot on the bottom step when his cell phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out and looked at the screen. It was a text message from his wife. It read that she had just driven into town to pick up milk from the grocery store and would be back in 20 minutes. Thomas stared at the glowing screen, the cold air of the basement suddenly feeling like ice against his skin. From the top of the dark staircase, the voice spoke again. It repeated the exact same phrase with the exact same casual intonation. It asked him to come up and look at something outside. Thomas did not answer. He slowly backed away from the stairs, retreating into the shadows of the concrete walls. He realized that the voice was not coming from the kitchen. It was coming from the narrow gap beneath the door at the top of the stairs, vibrating through the wood with an unnatural, mechanical precision. He stood in the damp darkness for what felt like hours, gripping a heavy iron wrench in his right hand. Above him, the pacing began. It was not the sound of dragging, but the heavy, deliberate thud of boots walking across the hardwood floor of the kitchen. The footsteps matched Thomas's own gait perfectly. He listened as the entity moved through their home, opening cabinets, running the faucet, mimicking the mundane sounds of a quiet evening. It was playing house. It was wearing their routine like a stolen piece of clothing. When the headlights of his wife's car finally swept across the driveway, the footsteps above him abruptly stopped. Thomas heard the front door open, heard his wife calling out a greeting, the rustle of paper grocery bags being set on the counter. He waited for another voice to answer her. He waited for a scream, but there was only silence, followed by her footsteps walking toward the basement door. She opened it and called down, asking why he was sitting in the dark. Her voice was real. The air in the house had returned to normal. They moved out of Dartmoor County exactly 4 days later. They broke their lease, packed only what could fit in the back of their vehicle, and left the heavy furniture behind. They never returned to collect the rest. The property sat vacant for years, slowly being reclaimed by the aggressive overgrowth of the Pacific Northwest. The windows became clouded with grime, and the roof eventually sagged under the weight of accumulated pine needles. But the legend of the Dartmoor mimic remains a quietly discussed topic among the locals who live near the state forest. Hikers are strictly advised to stay on marked trails and to never venture into the woods alone. The warning is not just for the risk of getting lost or encountering wildlife, it is because of the reports that still occasionally surface at the local ranger station. Reports of hikers hearing their own names called from the bottom of deep ravines, reports of missing campers whose voices are heard crying out in the fog, weeks after the search operations have been officially suspended. There is one detail from Thomas's final police report that locals rarely mention to outsiders. When he finally walked upstairs that night, after his wife had returned from the store, he noticed something resting on the kitchen counter. Next to the paper grocery bags was the heavy steel flashlight he had used during the first incident weeks prior. He had left it on his bedside table that morning, but there it sat, perfectly centered on the counter, still cold to the touch. The entity had not just mimicked their voices, it had left a quiet, mocking proof that it had been inside all along, watching them learn how to be afraid. Montana Rangers logged the same signal for several nights. The hiss of the radio broke at exactly 3:12 a.m., replaced by a wet, heavy sound that did not belong on the emergency frequency. It was not the snap of static, nor was it the sharp tone of an accidental microphone click. It sounded like something large breathing slowly into a receiver, accompanied by the faint, rhythmic crunch of snow under heavy boots. The transmission lasted for 40 seconds before fading back into the white noise of Channel 6. In the isolated watchtower of Station 4, perched high above a vast, frozen expanse of Montana wilderness, the duty ranger simply sat in the dark and listened. The wilderness in late November was a place of absolute isolation. The tourist season had ended months ago, and the deep valleys were already buried under several feet of early winter snow. Only a skeletal crew remained to monitor the high ridges connected to the outside world by a daisy chain of radio repeaters bolted to the freezing peaks. The nearest paved road was 45 miles away. If something went wrong, help was at least a day's journey by snowmobile. The ranger on duty noted the strange transmission in the nightly logbook, marking it down as a phantom signal caused by atmospheric bouncing, a common enough occurrence in the high mountains. But the following night, at exactly 3:12 a.m., the radio cracked open again. The static dropped away instantly, leaving a dead, empty channel. Then the breathing returned. It was louder this time, closer to the microphone, wet and ragged, dragging in the cold air with a slow, deliberate rhythm. Behind the breathing, there was the same steady crunching sound. Something walking through deep snow. The ranger reached for the handset, his thumb hovering over the transmission button, but training held him back. You did not speak into a blind emergency channel unless someone requested aid. He listened as the footsteps seemed to grow louder, as if whoever held the radio was marching steadily toward the microphone itself. By the third night, a deep unease had settled heavily into the watchtower. The ranger had contacted Station 9, located across the valley on the southern ridge, to ask if they had been logging the midnight interference. The operator at Station 9 confirmed the reports. They had heard it too. According to their directional logs, the signal was not bouncing off the upper atmosphere. It was originating from deep within the Blackwood Basin, a densely forested ravine that had been completely inaccessible since the first major blizzard in October. There were no hiking trails down there, no logging roads, and certainly no power sources for a radio transmitter. Yet, the signal was strong, cutting through the high ridge winds with absolute clarity. The Rangers decided to triangulate the broadcast if it happened again. At 3:10 a.m., both men sat by their respective consoles, the green glow of the dials illuminating their small, frost-covered windows. At precisely 3:12 a.m., the squelch broke. The ragged, wet breathing filled both cabins simultaneously. But this time, the footsteps stopped. The deep, agonizing breaths continued for 10 seconds, and then a voice spoke. It was not a human voice. It sounded like a tape recorder playing backwards, a strange metallic distortion that tried to mimic the cadence of human speech without forming actual words. It was a chaotic string of vowels strung together in a hollow, mocking tone. The ranger at Station 4 keyed his microphone. He broke protocol, stating that this was an official channel and instructing the broadcaster to identify themselves. The strange voice stopped immediately. The breathing returned for a few seconds, followed by the heavy click of the transmission ending. The radio went back to hissing static. Across the valley, the operator at Station 9 came over the internal frequency, his voice tight with tension. He had locked onto the origin point of the signal. It was indeed coming from the bottom of the Blackwood Basin, but there was a glaring problem. The signal had originated from an area where the timber was so thick even a tracked vehicle could not pass through. The next morning, the ranger at Station 4 began digging through the archival logbooks stored in the metal cabinets beneath the main desk. He was looking for any history of strange radio bounce in the basin, any old repeater stations that might have been abandoned and somehow powered back on. He pulled a dusty binder from 1994. As he turned the brittle pages, his finger stopped on a handwritten entry dated November 12, 1994. The duty officer at the time had logged an unknown transmission at 3:12 a.m. The notes described heavy breathing, the sound of footsteps in snow, and a voice that sounded broken and artificial. According to the old log, the 1994 transmissions had continued for 6 consecutive nights. On the 7th night, the duty ranger had requested a search and rescue flyover of the Blackwood Basin, convinced someone was lost and slowly freezing to death while clutching an open radio. The flyover was conducted the following afternoon. The helicopters found nothing but unbroken snow. No tracks, no camps, no signs of life. But the ranger who had written the log never returned for his next shift. The record stated he had resigned abruptly, leaving his gear in the tower and hiking down the mountain alone. The sun set early that evening, casting long, bruised shadows across the snowfields. The wind picked up, rattling the thick glass of the watchtower windows. The ranger at Station 4 made sure the heavy deadbolt on the reinforced wooden door was thrown entirely shut. He stoked the small wood stove, trying to push the damp cold out of the small room, but a strange chill seemed to radiate from the radio console itself. He sat in the low light, watching the digital clock slowly cycle toward 3 a.m. Across the valley, Station 9 was completely silent. The radio check-in at midnight had been brief, both men too on edge to make small talk. 3:12 a.m. arrived. The radio remained silent. The ranger let out a slow breath, thinking perhaps the atmospheric conditions had finally shifted, burying whatever ghost signal was haunting the valley. Then, at 3:14 a.m., the radio clicked. It did not hiss. It simply opened into dead, silent air. There was no breathing this time. No footsteps crunching in the deep snow. There was only the faint, echoing sound of wind blowing through pine trees, captured by a microphone somewhere out in the dark. Then the voice spoke, but it was not the distorted, chaotic string of vowels from the night before. It was a voice the ranger recognized instantly. It was his own. The radio played back his exact transmission from the previous night, down to the slight hesitation and the static pop of the button. The recording played back into the quiet room. "This is an official channel. Identify yourself." The playback sounded hollow, stripped of all warmth, as if it were echoing out of a deep canyon. The ranger stared at the speaker, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had not recorded that transmission. There was no tape deck in the tower. The playback ended, and the open air returned. Then his voice played again. "This is an official channel. Identify yourself." Only this time, the words were stretched, the pitch dropping lower and lower until it sounded like a heavy, mechanical groan. The words twisted into a slow, rhythmic distortion that mimicked the wet breathing from the first night. Whatever was down in the valley had not just been making noise, it had been learning. The internal frequency buzzed. It was Station 9. The operator's voice was barely a whisper. He told the ranger at Station 4 to look at the triangulation data. The ranger glanced at the secondary monitor. The blinking green dot, representing the origin of the unknown signal, was no longer resting at the bottom of the Blackwood Basin. It was moving. It was ascending the steep western ridge. It was moving straight up the incline through the dense, impassable timber, heading directly towards Station 4. The ranger watched the screen in silent horror. The dot was moving at an impossible speed. No human could climb a 40-degree incline through waist-deep snow in the dark. A snowmobile would have been loud enough to hear across the valley, and it could not navigate the tightly packed pines. Yet the signal marched steadily upward, covering hundreds of feet every minute. The open radio channel continued to broadcast the sound of the wind, but now the heavy, wet breathing had returned. It was louder, faster, matching the pace of something climbing relentlessly toward the summit. The wind outside the tower suddenly died down, leaving an oppressive, suffocating silence around the glass cabin. The only sound in the world was the dreadful, rhythmic breathing pouring from the radio speaker. The ranger backed away from the console, moving toward the center of the room. He realized that the breathing on the radio was no longer accompanied by the sound of crunching snow. The footsteps had stopped. The transmission was perfectly clear now, entirely free of static. The green dot on the monitor blinked one last time, resting precisely on the coordinates of Station 4, before the screen went completely black. The radio channel remained open. The breathing was so loud it rattled the small plastic casing of the speaker. It sounded wet and hungry, echoing in the confined space of the watchtower. The ranger stood frozen, staring at the reinforced door. Slowly, over the sound of the broadcast, he heard a physical noise outside the cabin. It was the heavy, distinct squeak of weight pressing down on the wooden planks of the exterior catwalk. Something had just stepped onto the deck that wrapped around the tower. The breathing on the radio stopped. At the exact same moment, something pressed itself against the heavy glass of the north-facing window. The ranger turned his head slowly. The security lights outside had burned out hours ago, leaving the deck in absolute darkness. But in the faint green glow of the radio dials, he could see a shape blocking the stars. It was tall, too tall to be a man, its silhouette hunched over the glass. A thick, pale mist began to form on the outside of the window pane, condensing as whatever stood there exhaled slowly against the freezing glass. The radio squelch snapped violently, emitting a high-pitched screech of feedback that forced the ranger to cover his ears. The sound was deafening, a localized blast of interference that shattered the quiet of the room. He squeezed his eyes shut, waiting for the glass to break, waiting for the door to splinter inward. The feedback wailed for 10 agonizing seconds before abruptly cutting out. The radio clicked off. The power to the console died. The watchtower was plunged into absolute pitch-black silence. When the morning sun finally broke over the eastern ridge, casting a brilliant, blinding light across the snowfields, the relief crew from the lowlands tried to raise Station 4 for the daily check-in. There was no response. After 2 hours of silence, a tracked vehicle was dispatched up the logging road to investigate. They found the watchtower securely locked from the inside. The wood stove was completely cold. The radio console had been entirely dismantled, its wires ripped from the wall and scattered across the floor in a chaotic tangle. The ranger was gone. There were no signs of a struggle, and more unsettlingly, there were no tracks leading away from the catwalk into the fresh snow. It was as if he had simply vanished into the freezing air. The official incident report blamed a catastrophic electrical failure and severe isolation psychosis, citing the dismantled radio as proof of a mental breakdown. But the logbooks from that week were never entered into the public record. And according to the locals who live near the edge of the park boundaries, if you tune a shortwave radio to the emergency frequency in the dead of winter, somewhere around 3 a.m., you can still hear it. The sound of wet breathing, heavy footsteps in the snow, and a voice trying to remember how to speak. A missing 411 case where footprints suddenly stopped. The footprints in the morning frost did not fade away slowly, nor did they show any signs of a struggle or a sudden violent fall. They simply stopped. It was near the edge of a high granite ridge, about 2 miles north of the main trail, in an area of the state forest thick with ancient pine and jagged limestone outcroppings. The search coordinator, a man who had spent 30 years tracking missing persons through these specific mountains, knelt and stared at the final depression in the pale white earth. The left boot print was deep, pressing heavily through the crisp layer of frost and into the damp, dark soil beneath. There was no right boot print to follow it. Beyond that single heavy indentation, there was only a vast, undisturbed sheet of frost covering the flat stone of the ridge. Nothing had brushed against the nearby ferns. No low-hanging branches were broken. It was as if the man had stepped forward with his left foot and simply ceased to be tethered to the ground. The geography of the upper basin was notoriously deceptive, a sprawling network of deep ravines and dense timber that could easily turn a seasoned hiker around. But the missing man was not a tourist. His name was Elias, a local surveyor who knew the topography of the northern ridge better than anyone in the county. He had walked out of his small cabin at 6 o'clock on a Tuesday morning in late October. The air that day had been crisp but clear, the kind of autumn morning that drew locals deep into the woods before the heavy winter snows arrived. He was dressed appropriately for the season in a heavy wool jacket, sturdy leather boots, and carried a small canvas pack with enough supplies to last well through the afternoon. According to the missing person report, Elias had only intended to check a line of remote trail cameras he maintained along the eastern edge of the property line. His wife told the 911 operator that he knew every stone and creek in that section of the woods. He had promised to return by noon for lunch. When 3 o'clock in the afternoon passed with no sign of him, a quiet, creeping unease settled over the house. When dusk arrived, bringing with it a sharp drop in temperature and the deep, total darkness of the mountain valley, that unease turned into a pressing emergency. By midnight, the first official search teams had already assembled at the trailhead with high-powered flashlights, radios, and a team of tracking dogs. The tracking dogs provided the first clear indication that this would not be a standard search and rescue operation. The handlers brought 3 experienced bloodhounds to the front porch of the cabin, allowing them to catch Elias's scent from a worn flannel shirt. Initially, the dogs performed exactly as trained. They pulled eagerly at their long leashes, leading the handlers up the familiar winding incline behind the property. They moved swiftly for the first hour, cutting through the dense, dark timber with absolute purpose, their noses close to the damp earth. But as the search party crossed the lower tree line and entered the shadow of the upper ridge, the behavior of the animals drastically changed. The lead dog suddenly stopped pulling. It lowered its head, sniffing frantically at a single patch of dead, frozen grass, before letting out a low, trembling whine and backing away. Within minutes, all 3 dogs sat rigidly in the cold dirt, refusing to take another step forward. They did not bark at the darkness. They did not circle looking for a lost scent. They simply sat close to their handlers, staring up into the black canopy of the towering pines, shivering violently despite their thick coats. The handlers eventually had to carry the dogs back down the trail, leaving the human volunteers to push forward alone. Witnesses in the search party later claimed that the woods felt entirely dead that night. The wind, which usually howled relentlessly through the narrow canyons of the basin, had dropped to an absolute unnatural standstill. The silence was so profound and heavy that the searchers could hear the blood rushing in their own ears, and the rhythmic squeak of their waterproof gear seemed to echo for miles. Usually, the forest at night was alive with the rustling of small animals in the underbrush, the sharp creak of settling wood, and the distant, lonely call of owls. But on that night, several seasoned rangers reported feeling an immense, suffocating pressure in the air, as if they were walking through the interior of a massive soundproof room. Every beam of light sweeping through the trees seemed to stop short, swallowed by an unusual density in the dark. At 3:30 a.m., a team of volunteers sweeping the floor of the lower ravine found the first physical piece of evidence. It was Elias's canvas backpack, sitting perfectly upright on the flat, mossy surface of a large river boulder. It had not been dropped in a panic or thrown aside in a rush. The shoulder straps were neatly arranged, tucked carefully beneath the base of the bag, and all the buckles were securely fastened. Inside, they found his metal water bottle, entirely full, alongside his compass and a spare pair of heavy insulated gloves. The most unsettling detail of the discovery was the placement of his 2-way radio. It was resting perfectly balanced on top of the closed backpack. The power switch was turned on, indicating the battery was still alive, but the volume dial had been rotated completely down to 0. It was a bizarre and troubling contradiction. A man lost or injured in the wilderness relies on a radio as his primary lifeline to the outside world. To deliberately silence the device and abandon it so carefully on a rock suggested either a calm, intentional choice to vanish or a state of mind that could no longer comprehend the concept of rescue. As the sun finally rose, casting long, pale, gray shadows across the basin, the trackers located a distinct set of boot prints in the soft mud near the boulder. The tracks clearly belonged to Elias, perfectly matching the heavy, deep-lugged tread pattern of his winter boots, but the path they carved through the landscape made no logical sense. Instead of heading back down the gradual slope toward the safety of the valley and the highway, the prints turned away from home. They aimed directly toward the steepest, most unforgiving section of the mountain, a tangled mass of briars and loose scree. According to the lead rescue coordinator, the stride of the footprints was deeply alarming. The distance between the left and right impressions was impossibly wide. The spacing suggested that Elias was either running at a breakneck, desperate speed up a 45-degree incline or taking massive, leaping bounds through thick underbrush that should have been physically impenetrable. A human being could not maintain that kind of momentum up a mountain face without tripping, stumbling, or leaving signs of broken branches and crushed vegetation. Yet, the tracks were clean, perfectly spaced, and relentless in their upward trajectory. 200 yards further up the punishing incline, the team found another piece of the puzzle, and it only deepened the growing sense of dread. Draped carefully over a low-hanging hemlock branch was Elias's heavy wool winter jacket. It was not torn, snagged, or hastily discarded. It had been meticulously unbuttoned, taken off, and folded neatly over the damp wood. The temperature in the valley had dipped to 28 degrees overnight. Stripping off a primary layer of winter clothing in sub-freezing conditions is a recognized symptom of late-stage hypothermia, a fatal phenomenon known as paradoxical undressing, where a freezing brain falsely signals to the body that it is burning up. Yet, the veteran trackers noted immediately that the timeline for hypothermia simply did not fit the physical evidence. Based on the distance from his cabin, Elias would have reached this specific spot only 2 or 3 hours after leaving home, far too early for the deep, delirious final stages of freezing to set in. Furthermore, the victims of hypothermia walk with a staggering, chaotic gait as their motor functions shut down. Elias's footprints leading away from the abandoned jacket remain straight, deep, and incredibly wide, showing a level of physical power and purpose that directly contradicted the symptoms of a dying man. At 9:15 a.m., the radio operator stationed back at the base camp experienced a highly unusual anomaly. For several uninterrupted minutes, a burst of thick, heavy static broke through the primary search and rescue channel. The operator attempted to clear the frequency, asking for any team in the field to identify themselves and report their status. The static did not break. Instead, it slowly shifted in tone and pitch, forming a rhythmic mechanical pulse that sounded almost like heavy, labored breathing, echoing through miles of empty, hollow pipe. Behind the dense wall of static, faint, metallic clicking sounds began to echo in a slow, deliberate, and entirely unnatural pattern. The transmission lasted for exactly 2 minutes before the channel snapped back to dead, empty silence. The operator immediately radioed all the search teams in the field. Every unit confirmed that their radios were secure and none of them had triggered their microphones. The origin of the signal was never traced, and no other frequencies in the area reported the interference. By 11 o'clock in the morning, the primary tracking team finally reached the high granite ridge. The punishing terrain here leveled out into a barren, windswept expanse of pale stone, broken only by thin, shallow patches of frosted soil and dead moss. This was the exact location where they found the final, impossible sequence of footprints. They followed the wide, bounding strides across a shallow depression of dirt that led toward the sudden drop-off of the cliff. The tracks moved in a perfectly straight, unwavering line. The searchers walked parallel to the prints, giving them a wide berth, deeply careful not to disturb the evidence. They counted exactly 12 massive steps across the morning frost. And then there was the 13th step. The left boot drove deep into the soft, yielding earth, crushing a thick layer of dead green moss. The toe of the print was angled slightly forward, deeply embedded, implying a tremendous amount of forward momentum. But there was absolutely no right footprint to follow it. The trackers instantly fanned out, circling the immediate area in a wide 50-foot radius. They shone high-powered flashlights into the narrow, dark crevices of the surrounding rock. They swept the distant tree line, looking for any sign of broken timber. They looked for signs that Elias had jumped to another rock, but the nearest boulder was 30 feet away. They looked for signs of a sudden fall, a dragging rope, or the massive sweeping tracks of a large predator that might have carried a man away. There was nothing to be found. The earth was entirely undisturbed. The delicate crystalline frost on the granite just inches away from that final boot print remained entirely intact, glittering like broken glass under the cold, pale sunlight. The trail simply ceased to exist. As the searchers stood in a circle around the impossible end of the trail, the atmosphere in the upper basin violently shifted. The oppressive, heavy silence of the morning was suddenly broken by a deep, low humming wind that seemed to vibrate directly through the thick rubber soles of their boots. The sky above the ridge, which had been a clear, piercing, cloudless blue just moments before, darkened with a terrifying and unnatural speed. Thick, bruised gray clouds rolled over the jagged peaks, sealing the valley floor in a sudden, premature twilight. The temperature plummeted 10 degrees in a matter of minutes, chilling the sweat on the necks of the searchers. Small, hard pellets of ice began to fall from the blackening sky, striking the granite ridge with sharp, rhythmic taps that sounded like scattering nails. The lead rescue coordinator knew the brutal protocol for sudden mountain weather. A squall moving this fast in the upper basin could easily trap, freeze, and kill an entire team of experienced men. Reluctantly, with a heavy heart, he keyed his radio and gave the absolute order to abandon the ridge and fall back to the staging area. The men cast one last, long look at the single, final boot print resting alone in the frost before turning away and beginning the dangerous descent. By the time they reached the safety of the lower tree line, the snow was falling in heavy, blinding horizontal sheets. The unseasonal storm locked the mountain down for 3 full days, burying the high ridge under 4 feet of dense, heavy, wet snow. The weather effectively erased the strange trail, destroyed any remaining scent markers, and buried whatever evidence might have been left on the stone. When the deep thaw finally came weeks later, local rangers made one last quiet attempt to search the high areas of the basin. They did not find Elias. They did not find his remains, his missing clothing, or his other boot. They did, however, find one of the remote trail cameras he had gone out into the woods to check on that very first morning. It was strapped tightly to the trunk of an old birch tree about 1 mile south of where his footprints had inexplicably vanished. The plastic outer casing of the camera was deeply cracked, and the battery cover was missing, but the memory card sealed inside the waterproof housing was miraculously still intact. Investigators pulled the memory card and reviewed the digital footage in a locked, windowless room back at the local ranger station. According to the heavily redacted incident report later obtained by researchers, the camera had captured only a single, silent photograph at 2:45 p.m. on the day Elias disappeared. The image was incredibly grainy, shot in poor lighting under the dense, shadowing canopy of the pines. In the extreme foreground of the image, the very edge of Elias's heavy wool jacket was partially visible. It was slightly out of focus and blurred, capturing the exact moment he was walking past the hidden lens. But the true focus of the camera's automated sensor was drawn to the distant background. Deep in the dark, tangled timber, perfectly aligned with the direction Elias was walking, the shapes of the ancient trees appeared strangely distorted and bent. The shadows in the photograph did not match the natural angle of the afternoon sun. Instead, the darkness seemed to pool together into a single, unnatural, towering shape that stood between the trees, appearing to absorb all the ambient light around it. There were no distinct facial features, no reflections of eyes, and no recognizable outline of a natural animal. It was just a profound, empty, towering mass of darkness standing perfectly still among the pines, waiting on the exact path that Elias was walking toward. The case of the missing surveyor remains officially open, filed quietly under unexplained local disappearances. The dense woods surrounding the upper basin were eventually closed to casual hikers, with the state citing dangerously unstable terrain and deeply unpredictable weather patterns as the official reason. But those who have lived in the shadow of the valley for generations still talk quietly about the man who walked up the mountain and simply stepped off the face of the earth. The story has woven itself into the fabric of the local folklore, becoming a whispered warning passed down to young hunters. They say that sometimes, in the absolute dead of winter, when the biting wind completely drops and the ancient trees grow utterly, unnaturally silent, you can still find massive, wide, bounding footprints carved deeply into the fresh snow. Those foolish enough to track them follow the impossible strides for miles, winding through the darkest and most isolated parts of the forest until they finally reach an open clearing or a high, lonely ridge. And there, alone in the freezing, absolute silence, the tracks always stop. In the Nahanni Valley, locals still avoid one section of the river. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police Patrol found the camp at twilight, nestled in a deep, shadowed bend of the South Nahanni River. It was the autumn of 1908. The fire ring had been cold for weeks, the ashes washed flat by heavy rains, supplies were stacked neatly beside a thick canvas tent, sacks of flour and dried beans sat entirely untouched, while expensive gold prospecting equipment was laid out methodically in the damp moss. But what caused the officers to draw their rifles and step back into the shadows was not the abandoned gear, it was the shape lying just beyond the tree line. Wrapped in heavy winter furs, the body of a man was strapped tightly to a wooden sled. His hands were securely bound, and his head was entirely missing. This discovery would become the first official record of a mystery that would stain the remote Canadian wilderness for over a century. The Nahanni River carves a violent path through the Northwest Territories, surrounded by limestone walls that rise thousands of feet into the sky. It is a place of staggering beauty and extreme hostility. Deep within the canyons, geothermal hot springs heat the frozen earth, creating bizarre tropical microclimates where rare plants bloom in the dead of winter. Thick, sulfurous white fog constantly bleeds from these vents, rolling across the forest floor and swallowing the landscape in an impenetrable veil. To the indigenous Dene people who have lived on the borders of this wilderness for thousands of years, the valley was not a place of refuge. It was a place to be avoided at all costs. The body found tied to the sled belonged to one of the McLeod brothers, Willie and Frank, two prospectors who had ventured into the canyon 3 years earlier in search of a legendary lost gold mine. According to reports, the brothers had ignored the warnings of local guides who spoke of an evil presence dwelling deep within the mist. When the search party eventually located the second brother a short distance from the camp, his remains mirrored the first. His head was also gone. Police reports from the time noted that the camp showed no signs of a struggle. There were no scattered belongings, no torn canvas, and no defensive wounds on the bodies. It was as if whatever had come for them had done so with calm, methodical precision. Investigators initially blamed the grim condition of the bodies on scavenging animals, suggesting that bears or wolves had carried off the skulls. But seasoned trappers in the region pointed out the terrifying inconsistencies in this theory. Animals do not bind a man's hands. They do not strap a body to a sled. And scavengers do not selectively remove a human head while leaving the rest of the body, along with the camp's entire food supply, completely untouched. A deep unease settled over the local trading posts. The area quickly earned a dark nickname among prospectors and trappers, a name it still holds today. They called it the Valley of the Headless Men. For nearly a decade, the canyons remained largely empty. The harsh winters and the lingering fear kept most outsiders away, but the lure of untouched gold is a powerful force. In 1917, a rugged Swiss prospector named Martin Jorgensen decided to test his luck in the valley. He was an experienced woodsman, well-equipped to handle the brutal subarctic conditions. For months, he seemed to thrive. He built a sturdy log cabin near the riverbank, occasionally sending word back to civilization that he had struck a rich vein of gold. He wrote that he had found his fortune and that he planned to stay in the valley until the following spring, but spring came and Jorgensen never emerged from the canyon. A group of travelers passing through the area noticed a column of dark smoke rising from the deep woods. When they investigated, they found Jorgensen's cabin burned to its stone foundations. The heavy logs had been reduced to smoldering embers. Among the ashes, they discovered his skeleton. His rifle was found a few feet away, fully loaded and unfired. And just like the McLeod brothers before him, Jorgensen's skull was nowhere to be found. The gold he had claimed to discover was missing entirely. The silence that surrounded the burned cabin offered no clues. There were no tracks leading away from the ruins, only the quiet rush of the Nahanni River echoing off the canyon walls. The pattern was too specific to ignore. Rumors began to spread wildly through the Northern Territories. Some believed that a hostile, uncontacted tribe lived deep in the mountains, violently protecting the valley's gold. Others whispered about the Naha, a mythical, fierce tribe from local folklore that was said to dwell in the high peaks, descending only to slaughter those who trespassed. But the indigenous guides insisted the Naha had vanished without a trace centuries ago. The elders warned that the threat in the valley was not a tribe of men. They spoke of evil spirits, of massive creatures that walked upright in the fog, and of an ancient sickness that infected the very soil of the canyon. Despite the grim history, the valley claimed another victim in 1945. An Ontario miner named Ernest Savard was found dead near his camp in the same region. His body was discovered inside his heavy sleeping bag, zipped up tightly against the freezing night air. He had not been burned, nor had he been bound, but the result was the same. His head had been cleanly removed, and it was missing from the campsite. The police investigation concluded with no suspects and no explanation. The sheer isolation of the area made it impossible to secure a crime scene or track down leads. Whoever or whatever was responsible for the mutilations had thousands of square miles of dense, unforgiving wilderness to hide in. By the late 1960s, the era of the lone gold prospector had largely ended, replaced by organized expeditions and recreational adventurers. A group of 4 experienced outdoorsmen traveled to the valley, determined to navigate the treacherous rapids of the Nahanni River. They were well aware of the legends, viewing them as campfire ghost stories meant to scare away tourists. They set up camp on a wide gravel riverbank, surrounded by towering spruce trees and the ever-present sulfur mist from the nearby hot springs. The evening was uneventful. They cooked their food, secured their supplies in bear-proof containers, and retired to their individual tents as the temperature plummeted. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, one of the men awoke to a strange sensation. He later described it to authorities as a feeling of immense atmospheric pressure, a sudden heaviness in the air that made it difficult to breathe. The ambient noise of the wilderness had completely vanished. The wind had stopped howling through the canyon. Even the rushing sound of the river seemed muffled, as if wrapped in thick cotton. He lay awake in his sleeping bag, listening intently to the unnatural silence. Then he heard a sound that made his blood run cold. It was a heavy, wet, dragging noise, moving slowly over the smooth river stones just outside his tent. It sounded like a massive wet sack being pulled across the gravel. The dragging was accompanied by a low, rhythmic thud, like the footsteps of something unbelievably heavy. The man held his breath, clutching his hunting knife, too paralyzed by fear to unzip his tent. The dragging sound stopped right beside the thin nylon wall of his shelter. He could hear a deep, ragged exhalation, a breathing so loud and guttural it vibrated in his chest. A foul stench leaked into the tent, smelling of rotten meat and stagnant swamp water. The creature, or person, stood there in the absolute dark for what felt like an eternity. Then, the heavy footsteps slowly moved away, retreating toward the edge of the forest. The man did not sleep the rest of the night. He lay frozen, waiting for the sun to rise. When dawn finally broke, casting a pale gray light through the mist, he emerged from his tent. The camp looked completely normal. The bear-proof containers were untouched, the fire pit was undisturbed. But when he looked toward the tent of his friend, who had been sleeping closest to the tree line, he noticed the flap was hanging wide open. He walked over and looked inside. His friend was gone. His heavy hiking boots were still sitting neatly by the entrance, his winter coat was draped over his backpack, but his sleeping bag and the man inside it had vanished. The remaining 3 men desperately searched the perimeter of the camp. Near the edge of the dense spruce trees, they found a wide path of crushed vegetation, as if something incredibly heavy had been dragged directly into the forest. They followed the trail for nearly a mile, shouting their friend's name into the thick, sulfurous fog. They received no answer. The tracks eventually disappeared at the edge of a sheer cliff face, dropping hundreds of feet into a jagged ravine. Hanging from a branch near the edge, nearly 10 feet off the ground, they found a torn, bloody piece of a nylon sleeping bag. A massive search operation was launched in the following days. Search and rescue teams scoured the canyon, utilizing helicopters and tracker dogs. The dogs were brought to the edge of the woods where the sleeping bag was found, but according to the handlers, the animals panicked. They whined, tucked their tails, and absolutely refused to enter the tree line. The search lasted for 2 weeks, but not a single trace of the missing camper was ever found. He was eventually declared dead, another tragic victim of the unforgiving Nahanni wilderness. The official report cited an animal attack, likely a massive grizzly bear, though no bear tracks were ever identified near the camp. Over the years, strange reports have continued to leak out of the valley. Pilots flying small float planes low over the canyons have reported experiencing sudden, inexplicable compass failures and electrical malfunctions. Some have sworn they saw massive, dark silhouettes standing entirely still in the fog, figures that looked vaguely human but were far too large. Hikers who stray too close to the hot springs often report the sudden, overpowering stench of rotting meat, followed by the distinct sound of heavy, bipedal footsteps shadowing them from just out of sight. The feeling of being hunted is so intense that many turn back before completing their journey. Today, the Nahanni National Park Reserve is a protected area. Visitors are strictly regulated, and deep ventures into the canyons require specialized permits. Park rangers warn every group to stick together, to keep their campsites clean, and to never wander away from the firelight alone. But despite modern equipment, satellite phones, and global positioning systems, the valley remains an isolated, silent world of its own. The steep limestone walls block communication signals, and the sudden, violent weather changes can ground rescue helicopters for days. If you find yourself in trouble out there, you are entirely on your own. Some investigators still believe there is a rational explanation for the history of severed heads and vanished campers. They point to the extreme psychological toll of total isolation, suggesting that cabin fever or mercury poisoning from mining operations drove men to murder each other in gruesome ways. They argue that scavengers simply finished the job, carrying away the skulls. But these logical theories provide little comfort to those who have actually stood in the deep shadows of the canyon, listening to the wind howl through the rocks, watching the thick white fog pour out of the earth. The mystery of the valley remains a dark, open wound in the history of the Canadian North. The remains of Willie and Frank McLeod, Martin Jorgensen, and Ernest Savard were eventually buried, their case files gathering dust in forgotten archives. The gold they were searching for was never recovered. The indigenous locals continue to pass down the ancient warnings, refusing to camp near the haunted sections of the river. They know that the sheer, towering walls of the canyon keep secrets hidden perfectly in the dark. There is a stretch of the South Nahanni River where the water grows strangely calm, and the sulfur mist hangs so thick you cannot see the opposite bank. The silence there is heavy, almost suffocating, broken only by the occasional sound of rocks tumbling down the distant cliffs. If you stand by the water's edge at twilight, when the shadows stretch long across the gravel, you might hear a low, wet, dragging sound coming from the trees. According to those who know the legends, it is best not to turn your flashlight toward the noise. Whatever took the heads of the prospectors over a century ago never left the valley. It is still out there, hiding in the fog, waiting patiently for the fire to burn out. Montana Rangers logged the same signal for several nights. The hiss of the radio broke at exactly 3:12 a.m., replaced by a wet, heavy sound that did not belong on the emergency frequency. It was not the snap of static, nor was it the sharp tone of an accidental microphone click. It sounded like something large breathing slowly into a receiver, accompanied by the faint, rhythmic crunch of snow under heavy boots. The transmission lasted for 40 seconds before fading back into the white noise of Channel 6. In the isolated watchtower of Station 4, perched high above a vast, frozen expanse of Montana wilderness, The duty ranger simply sat in the dark and listened. The wilderness in late November was a place of absolute isolation. The tourist season had ended months ago, and the deep valleys were already buried under several feet of early winter snow. Only a skeletal crew remained to monitor the high ridges connected to the outside world by a daisy chain of radio repeaters bolted to the freezing peaks. The nearest paved road was 45 miles away. If something went wrong, help was at least a day's journey by snowmobile. The ranger on duty noted the strange transmission in the nightly logbook, marking it down as a phantom signal caused by atmospheric bouncing, a common enough occurrence in the high mountains. But the following night, at exactly 3:12 a.m., the radio cracked open again. The static dropped away instantly, leaving a dead, empty channel. Then the breathing returned. It was louder this time, closer to the microphone, wet and ragged, dragging in the cold air with a slow, deliberate rhythm. Behind the breathing, there was the same steady crunching sound. Something walking through deep snow. The ranger reached for the handset, his thumb hovering over the transmission button, but training held him back. You did not speak into a blind emergency channel unless someone requested aid. He listened as the footsteps seemed to grow louder, as if whoever held the radio was marching steadily toward the microphone itself. By the third night, a deep unease had settled heavily into the watchtower. The ranger had contacted Station 9, located across the valley on the southern ridge, to ask if they had been logging the midnight interference. The operator at Station 9 confirmed the reports. They had heard it too. According to their directional logs, the signal was not bouncing off the upper atmosphere. It was originating from deep within the Blackwood Basin, a densely forested ravine that had been completely inaccessible since the first major blizzard in October. There were no hiking trails down there, no logging roads, and certainly no power sources for a radio transmitter. Yet, the signal was strong, cutting through the high ridge winds with absolute clarity. The Rangers decided to triangulate the broadcast if it happened again. At 3:10 a.m., both men sat by their respective consoles, the green glow of the dials illuminating their small, frost-covered windows. At precisely 3:12 a.m., the squelch broke. The ragged, wet breathing filled both cabins simultaneously. But this time, the footsteps stopped. The deep, agonizing breaths continued for 10 seconds, and then a voice spoke. It was not a human voice. It sounded like a tape recorder playing backwards, a strange metallic distortion that tried to mimic the cadence of human speech without forming actual words. It was a chaotic string of vowels strung together in a hollow, mocking tone. The ranger at Station 4 keyed his microphone. He broke protocol, stating that this was an official channel and instructing the broadcaster to identify themselves. The strange voice stopped immediately. The breathing returned for a few seconds, followed by the heavy click of the transmission ending. The radio went back to hissing static. Across the valley, the operator at Station 9 came over the internal frequency, his voice tight with tension. He had locked onto the origin point of the signal. It was indeed coming from the bottom of the Blackwood Basin, but there was a glaring problem. The signal had originated from an area where the timber was so thick, even a tracked vehicle could not pass through. The next morning, the ranger at Station 4 began digging through the archival logbooks stored in the metal cabinets beneath the main desk. He was looking for any history of strange radio bounce in the basin, any old repeater stations that might have been abandoned and somehow powered back on. He pulled a dusty binder from 1994. As he turned the brittle pages, his finger stopped on a handwritten entry dated November 12, 1994. The duty officer at the time had logged an unknown transmission at 3:12 a.m. The notes described heavy breathing, the sound of footsteps in snow, and a voice that sounded broken and artificial. According to the old log, the 1994 transmissions had continued for 6 consecutive nights. On the 7th night, the duty ranger had requested a search and rescue flyover of the Blackwood Basin, convinced someone was lost and slowly freezing to death while clutching an open radio. The flyover was conducted the following afternoon. The helicopters found nothing but unbroken snow. No tracks, no camps, no signs of life. But the ranger who had written the log never returned for his next shift. The record stated he had resigned abruptly, leaving his gear in the tower and hiking down the mountain alone. The sun set early that evening, casting long, bruised shadows across the snowfields. The wind picked up, rattling the thick glass of the watchtower windows. The ranger at Station 4 made sure the heavy deadbolt on the reinforced wooden door was thrown entirely shut. He stoked the small wood stove, trying to push the damp cold out of the small room, but a strange chill seemed to radiate from the radio console itself. He sat in the low light, watching the digital clock slowly cycle toward 3 a.m. Across the valley, Station 9 was completely silent. The radio check-in at midnight had been brief, both men too on edge to make small talk. 3:12 a.m. arrived. The radio remained silent. The ranger let out a slow breath, thinking perhaps the atmospheric conditions had finally shifted, burying whatever ghost signal was haunting the valley. Then, at 3:14 a.m., the radio clicked. It did not hiss. It simply opened into dead, silent air. There was no breathing this time. No footsteps crunching in the deep snow. There was only the faint, echoing sound of wind blowing through pine trees, captured by a microphone somewhere out in the dark. Then the voice spoke, but it was not the distorted, chaotic string of vowels from the night before. It was a voice the ranger recognized instantly. It was his own. The radio played back his exact transmission from the previous night, down to the slight hesitation and the static pop of the button. The recording played back into the quiet room. "This is an official channel. Identify yourself." The playback sounded hollow, stripped of all warmth, as if it were echoing out of a deep canyon. The ranger stared at the speaker, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had not recorded that transmission. There was no tape deck in the tower. The playback ended, and the open air returned. Then his voice played again. "This is an official channel. Identify yourself." Only this time, the words were stretched, the pitch dropping lower and lower until it sounded like a heavy, mechanical groan. The words twisted into a slow, rhythmic distortion that mimicked the wet breathing from the first night. Whatever was down in the valley had not just been making noise, it had been learning. The internal frequency buzzed. It was Station 9. The operator's voice was barely a whisper. He told the ranger at Station 4 to look at the triangulation data. The ranger glanced at the secondary monitor. The blinking green dot, representing the origin of the unknown signal, was no longer resting at the bottom of the Blackwood Basin. It was moving. It was ascending the steep western ridge. It was moving straight up the incline through the dense, impassable timber, heading directly towards Station 4. The ranger watched the screen in silent horror. The dot was moving at an impossible speed. No human could climb a 40-degree incline through waist-deep snow in the dark. A snowmobile would have been loud enough to hear across the valley, and it could not navigate the tightly packed pines. Yet the signal marched steadily upward, covering hundreds of feet every minute. The open radio channel continued to broadcast the sound of the wind, but now the heavy, wet breathing had returned. It was louder, faster, matching the pace of something climbing relentlessly toward the summit. The wind outside the tower suddenly died down, leaving an oppressive, suffocating silence around the glass cabin. The only sound in the world was the dreadful, rhythmic breathing pouring from the radio speaker. The ranger backed away from the console, moving toward the center of the room. He realized that the breathing on the radio was no longer accompanied by the sound of crunching snow. The footsteps had stopped. The transmission was perfectly clear now, entirely free of static. The green dot on the monitor blinked one last time, resting precisely on the coordinates of Station 4, before the screen went completely black. The radio channel remained open. The breathing was so loud it rattled the small plastic casing of the speaker. It sounded wet and hungry, echoing in the confined space of the watchtower. The ranger stood frozen, staring at the reinforced door. Slowly, over the sound of the broadcast, he heard a physical noise outside the cabin. It was the heavy, distinct squeak of weight pressing down on the wooden planks of the exterior catwalk. Something had just stepped onto the deck that wrapped around the tower. The breathing on the radio stopped. At the exact same moment, something pressed itself against the heavy glass of the north-facing window. The ranger turned his head slowly. The security lights outside had burned out hours ago, leaving the deck in absolute darkness. But in the faint green glow of the radio dials, he could see a shape blocking the stars. It was tall, too tall to be a man, its silhouette hunched over the glass. A thick, pale mist began to form on the outside of the window pane, condensing as whatever stood there exhaled slowly against the freezing glass. The radio squelch snapped violently, emitting a high-pitched screech of feedback that forced the ranger to cover his ears. The sound was deafening, a localized blast of interference that shattered the quiet of the room. He squeezed his eyes shut, waiting for the glass to break, waiting for the door to splinter inward. The feedback wailed for 10 agonizing seconds before abruptly cutting out. The radio clicked off. The power to the console died. The watchtower was plunged into absolute pitch-black silence. When the morning sun finally broke over the eastern ridge, casting a brilliant, blinding light across the snowfields, the relief crew from the lowlands tried to raise Station 4 for the daily check-in. There was no response. After 2 hours of silence, a tracked vehicle was dispatched up the logging road to investigate. They found the watchtower securely locked from the inside. The wood stove was completely cold. The radio console had been entirely dismantled, its wires ripped from the wall and scattered across the floor in a chaotic tangle. The ranger was gone. There were no signs of a struggle, and more unsettlingly, there were no tracks leading away from the catwalk into the fresh snow. It was as if he had simply vanished into the freezing air. The official incident report blamed a catastrophic electrical failure and severe isolation psychosis, citing the dismantled radio as proof of a mental breakdown. But the logbooks from that week were never entered into the public record. And according to the locals who live near the edge of the park boundaries, if you tune a shortwave radio to the emergency frequency in the dead of winter, somewhere around 3 a.m., you can still hear it. The sound of wet breathing, heavy footsteps in the snow, and a voice trying to remember how to speak.